Steve had already mentioned our org structure. I just wanted to point out that, and this is the sort of the old way that we would show the org structure, that, and I wanted to point out a couple of additions in the last year. One of them is strictly in the operations area, that Amanda Bauer, our EPO lead, is now the Deputy Operations Director for Operations. And as she moved up and to take over more responsibilities there, she asked Lauren to help her with the actual education, public outreach, development, and leading that group. And so we're happy that those two additions have been made to the org structure. And then just to point out that Ian Good now has taken over as the ISO for the overall project. So there's lots more details in the staffing that you'll hear about in the breakouts, but I did want to at least cover those changes at the highest level. And that is consistent with the way you'll see it going forward, and that's the way that Steve had shown you the org structure. So getting into the first category of activity or on the agenda, I picked sort of the 5 major areas, or 4 major areas, plus sort of a follow-up of issues that were being addressed in the 2019 Joint Status Review. And those were a lot of discussion about dome, telescope mount, and safe integration. Then there was a lot of discussion, of course, in the cost and schedule recovery that we felt was necessary and how we would implement some scope options. There was several discussions about summit work planning and organization, in particular because you might recall at this time last year we had just lost our program manager for the telescope and site group, and with activities really ramping up in Chile, the whole work planning and organization structure was really important. And then, of course, there was the staff transition. There have been for the last couple of years, in fact, many discussions about exactly how staff will transition. So I'll give you an update on those 4 topics, and then also just a summary on the general recommendations and other topics that came up last year, just as a reminder. And so let me just jump right in. In regard to the dome, the telescope mount, safe integration, I'll just recall for everybody that the dome has been a technical challenge in and of itself. That was a fixed price contract that we let early on to European Industrial Engineering in Italy to fabricate and build the system at a fixed price of $12.5 million. In 2018, the EIE group announced that they had some severe cash flow issues, and that the price, as they were extending their schedule, they were having issues with even the overall cost of it, and that the impact to us was going to be on the order of $3.5 million. At the time, we weren't surprised because we had originally priced out the dome at $16 million, and so for them to come to the realization that they were actually at $16 million was not a big surprise. But we had a couple of choices. You'll recall that we had lots of discussion about, well, should we let them default? Should we just sue them? Should we arbitrate? Or should we partner? And our assessment at the time was that there was a lot of work to be done still. There was a lot of product in Italy still that we could not complete this in an efficient manner without them. And so we chose to partner. In doing so, we put a lot of tighter controls on the situation. We had a lot more interaction, and it prompted us, the cash flow issues prompted us and EIE to really reconcile lots of the design changes that happened at the FDR that they seemed very happy to just put off at the time. Cash was not a problem then, but now that it was, they were looking at all of the changes we made in the FDR for the dome, and we were accepting those parts that were our changes, and tried to help them out with their cash issues. As we got more involved with them, in 2019, we realized that there were actually even more overruns and that the cost was going up even higher. This is now ramped it up to the final level where we are now taking over contracts in Italy. We are fabricating remaining parts in Chile, and so that the extra costs on the order of $2 to $3 million are not going to EIE at this point, or not all of them, but that we are taking on any additional costs by doing the work ourselves. Still working with EIE, but these changes, these two sort of big incremental changes to a fixed price contract has really set a new paradigm in how to manage and how to deal with contractors. So I just wanted to remind everybody of that, because you'll hear from Jeff about the status, and I think it's an important backdrop and a reminder of the history as we go into what actually has been pretty good technical, very good technical progress, reasonable programmatic progress on the summit, and a continued excellent safety record. From the telescope mount, in particular, at this time last year, we were waiting for the telescope mount to arrive, and I can happily report that it did get there intact and safely, and that whole logistics operation worked out quite well. But that at the time, we were also very cognizant that for the TMA vendor to start integration, they had 4 criteria. They needed to have a dome crane. That dome crane required that dome rotation was available, plus that this slit was movable so that they could have good crane reach. And so the dome had to rotate. We needed an enclosure so that they could do critical alignments. In particular, they needed good environmental control for azimuth track installation. And they needed a way to get that track into the building. And so they needed to have an installation crane that was significant and available, or they needed our interior logistical path in place and functioning, which was our 80-ton internal lift. So those were the criteria that we were looking at last year, and those were going to push the schedule, particularly because of the dome. And what you'll hear from Jeff very quickly is you'll hear talk about a provisional dome crane that we were able to get in place. We were able to get a friction drive in place so the dome rotates. There was a temporary enclosure that we put in place around the azimuth track, and we were able to get our 500-ton crane on the site a little bit early. So all of that was dealt with. The TMA installation started, and in fact, got ahead of schedule by the time we had to shut down in March. From the safety standpoint and the integration standpoint, there have been a lot of effort and energy put into the coordination and into the formalities of how we do work with these contractors on the summit at the same time. So there's a very, in particular, this is an unfinished, massive, which will eventually be 600 tons of dome. It's not there yet, but it's a massive structure that has to rotate, and there's lots of work going on. And so we have a very elaborate procedure in place for how that happens and what inspections happen ahead of time before any dome rotation. And I can just generalize by saying that the safety teams, the technical teams, and the management teams have really coordinated quite well and have put a lot of energy into that coordination. And one of the premises is that the telescope mount takes priority, and so therefore the dome does suffer some delays in the integration, but they have been advancing. And this picture will appear again in Jeff's talk, but I wanted to just show you this from the standpoint that as the work coordination and controls really progressed and we really got into a rhythm with how to work with all of the teams, this is just a good example of how it progressed to being able to have 3 very large cranes, several man lifts, and many people working in close proximity to each other. And again, you'll hear much more of this in the telescope breakout. The next sort of area of issue that we were covering last year was in cost and schedule recovery. You'll recall that we, from the MRESC side, has actually always been a little tight in a percentage of contingency. We only started with 20%, but we recognize that 4.14, so basically 15 million in contingency, and even more importantly, only 3.5 months of schedule, particularly with the shadow of that telescope mount showing up later and all those contingents and all those prerequisites facing us. We were very worried about the schedule contingency. So these are the 3 panels there, are slides directly from the status review last year, showing the amount of financial contingency we had, and then also the schedule at the time. And I think we all recognize that these were low, and we were putting a lot of energy and a lot of discussion into how can we enact some of our scope options. What does that really look like to improve that situation? And we addressed that in two areas. One was that we replanned the sitcom activities, the testing and validation effort that you'll hear a lot from Chuck about. And that was in an LCR that we implemented in January, and that recovered 3 months and also $3.1 million and returned those to contingencies. And so this image right here is the final result of that replan, which includes 3 months of technical INT with the commissioning camera on the top left, and then there's 3 months to integrate the LSST cam and do its engineering checkout, and then there's another 2 months of on-sky observations for science verification. So that's you'll hear much more about that from Chuck, but that replan was enacted in January to recover a lot of schedule. And then also to recover cost, we pointed out that one of our top scope options for cost was in the cost of hardware for DM. And data management still had $11 million in hardware purchases that were put off to be started to be purchased next year. So we looked very closely at that and did an assessment that there was about $8 million of that was scope of hardware that was not necessary for us to complete our science requirements. We had always talked about putting that hardware in place so that the operations team would have hardware for data release 1, but that it was not actually required for us to do that to meet our requirements. So we worked with the agencies, and more importantly, we worked with the forming operations team to work out how to eliminate that $8.1 million and de-scope that from us. Because we'd always talked about putting it in, but de-scope it from the construction plan and work with the operations plan on how they would deal with that. So that's all worked out. You'll hear some more about that from Will and Bob. And we can always talk about that. Both of these scope options and both of these change requests later in the breakouts. But that was how we recovered 8.1 million. And then of course the 3.1 million I mentioned earlier from the commissioning replan. So that's how, and I'll show you the current status of the financial condition of the project later on in this talk that you can recognize those two changes from. The third area was in that summit work planning and organization. We showed you this chart or something very close to it as we were forming, and this was our proposal for what we were going to do with the org structure, particularly focused on Chile and particularly focused on the telescope and site leadership. And I'm very happy to report that these changes were formally enacted and have really worked out quite well. And you'll see a version of this slide, I think, with a little bit more naming details from Jeff in the telescope and site section. And then, of course, we can take breakouts to discuss it in even more detail. The other part of the prioritization in the work planning was to come up with a revised process. Now that we were entering into a phase where the work on the summit was far more complicated and was requiring a lot more interaction between our own groups. The whole work planning process had to be upgraded and updated and really revised and we had to put some more details to it. And so this is also a chart that we showed, at least a version hereof, and that's been implemented as we worked out some more of the details. And also over the last year, it's really proven to be very effective. And if you look at the bottom line, the red boxes, these are meetings that happen very continuously, where Chuck runs the meeting where we every week or every other week, depending on the amount of work going on, where we look at sort of the farther term. Are we strategically thinking about how to organize the work as that's coming out of the P6 plan? And then also every week, Jacques runs a meeting on Thursdays where we're looking at the sort of the 1 week to 2 month outlook and thinking about, are we going to have the resources? Can we actually schedule all of that in the work that's coming out from the plan? And then again, on Friday, there's another meeting that Jacques runs, which is very focused on, okay, now we know what we want to get done. How, do we have the staff? Can we get them in place? And can we actually do the very detailed integration and planning of that work for the next week? And then, of course, every day there's a daily stand-up tailgate / tasking meeting where we actually work out and discuss amongst the entire the entire site team in particular what's happening. And I should point out that throughout all of these meetings, we have both safety representation, we have management representation, and we have the technical representation. So this is really proven to work quite well. And this is just a screenshot, just showing you. This is 1 week, I guess, last summer, that shows you the JIRA tool that we use to coordinate the activity. That is brought up on the screen for particularly the weekly and everyday meetings, where we look at what's scheduled for the day and who's on site and what's happening. So the fourth area of issues that we were talking about last year was in staff transitions. And we have been talking about that for a while, because from a construction standpoint, I think we can all understand that if we can give our staff the security of knowing that there's continuity in their employment as they go through construction, then they're more willing to stay for the duration of construction and not leave prematurely. And so we've been working with primarily Rubin operations, Bob Blum and his team, and then also generically it's Slack to make sure there's an off-ramp for Slack personnel, and then also Noir Lab and its organizations to find those trajectories for all of the staff. And there's sort of two elements of it. One is there a place for them in the for our team in the long term? But also, when does that transition happen? How would we organize that transition so that it works best for construction and for the ultimate position that they'll take? So those are things that we've been focused on for quite a while, and it's been a real pleasure to work with Bob and Phil and the pre-ops team that's in place, that leadership team, to really work with them on naming people for their positions. And you'll hear more from Bob, but at this point in time, I believe Bob has 126 names for the 163 FTE that he has in his plan, that he and Phil have in the ops plan. And that's largely construction staff. And so that's a real step forward and really helpful as they've gone through gyrations of their plan and how they're getting funded. And again, you'll hear more from Bob. But the construction view of this, and our particular focus is, again, on the first slide, or the first bullet, is can we give our team that security? And then there's sort of three elements to that. There's an Aura component for the team. There's a Slack component for the team. And then we also recognize that there's critical partners. DM uses people at Washington, UW, Princeton, NCSA, all of these places, also the camera in France. And so these are also part of our thinking as we move forward. And just as an example, for Aura, when we look at the team, there's 115 Aura staff that are on Rubin construction. And at this point in time, 71 of those people are specifically named in the ops plan. 27 in addition are named to go into the Noir Lab, which is the Aura National Laboratory, and that's primarily in IT and EPO and in some general engineering areas. And then we expect 17 to be done after construction. And of those 17, I estimate that about 4 of them are people that we're going to have to work with, make sure that we put incentives in place to keep them there for the duration of construction. And our objective right now in working with, particularly with Bob on the operations side, is to finalize these details so that we can have these discussions in August. And Steve had already mentioned some of this, but the unrest in Chile was pretty dramatic, as you'll see in some of these videos. There was sort of 2 weeks of very direct impact, but really the more significant impact was in the tension in the staff, and just how this was disrupting at an individual level. And beyond that, there was all of our DOE team that was planning on traveling, their authorizations were declined. And so as the tensions were rising in our staff, we couldn't get our DM call or our Slack colleagues down there, which was actually causing very specific delays in the schedule. And so this was a fairly significant disruption. In addition, we were able to do much of the critical work and keep critical work going on the summit, but anything non-critical was getting delayed, and any float that was in the system for those non-critical work was starting to shrink. As a response to this, there were lots of I would say commissions, but we put some teams together to be dealing with the day-to-day impact. But also, more importantly, Aura initiated 2 very independent assessments on the safety and security in Chile. And so those 2 independent reviews, one based by consultants in Chile and one from consultants in the US, really did a nice job of reviewing our actual physical safety as well as processes. And Aura is in progress in making some additions and changes to increase that security. And then the last bullet there is just to note that the referendum that addresses the issues that started the social unrest, there's a referendum vote at the end of October of this year. And so if the COVID doesn't subside, or if it does subside, that we're likely to see some more issues starting there in October again. So that's something that we're dealing with and have dealt with, and that was a pretty prominent item as Steve had already introduced. The other one is the completeness criteria and the transition out of construction. I'll just remind you, and you'll see this from the other talks, that we have a very formal set of documents, our requirements and how we flow those down into the various elements. We've also put a lot of time and energy into how we verify those requirements. And the commissioning plan, which is LLC 79, synthesizes a lot of this into 10 points that we've shown for years now, which we originally identified as the operations readiness criteria, which we'd actually like to start calling the construction completion criteria, to be a little bit more specific. And this is just a precursor slide to the topic that you'll hear a lot more from Chuck about, both on the plenary and in the breakouts. The other part of that is how we transition. And originally, the MRESC project was self-contained. It was going to be one big project that got to the end and then handed everything over. There was only one completion milestone, which we called the ORR, the Operations Readiness Review. But we have understood that we could start handing parts over if we had them completed. And now that the project is stretching out and the critical path is identifying more float for various other elements, I think there's even more of an opportunity for us to really think about how we can transition parts out of construction. There's 2 parts of that. One is, are we done? Can we get to an incremental acceptance of these various things? Can we formally close various scope elements? And even if we don't hand them over, it simplifies the final acceptance. And so if we can adopt that strategy, then we can have a further discussion on should we hand things over? And then how do we hand things over? Who do we hand it over to? Does it make sense to hand things over? Is it a strategy that makes sense for both construction and operations? And so these are being considered. There's a very fruitful and healthy conversation at this point on that topic as we move forward. And particularly with the agencies. The NSF has adjusted their thinking and is fine with the idea of incremental handover. There's now a solid operations team where we can have fruitful conversations about what that looks like in that handover. And so that's all really good, and we're in a really good position to start having those discussions. And then just to highlight it, we are, as you can tell, making completion. We are completing various parts of the scope. We've closed out the base facility, or are about to, I should say. The Summit hotels the hotel rooms that we built, that's closed out. And so, as we finished those elements, we did do an internal formal acceptance so that we could hand it over, so that Noir Lab Central Operations could run those for us. And then we could start paying on a per use basis and still paying our part. But now we can introduce a more formal way to identify that those things were completed, those scope elements were completed, and get that acceptance done at the project level and at the agency level. And then it prompts other things, like what else can we do? We have an auxiliary telescope on the Summit that's getting nearer to the final scope of completion that we have in construction. The EPO team is on a trajectory; they're still on schedule, and there's every expectation that they can complete the 90 or vast majority of their original objectives on their original schedule, even though the rest of the project is extending out. And then parts of DM. Are there elements within the DM stack or the DM infrastructure that we might be able to hand over? There's no answers to these just yet, but I wanted to point out that we have made significant progress moving forward in having that conversation. And then, of course, with the replan after COVID, we have a great opportunity to implement and show that that concept can hold. The third sort of area of key issues this period has been in the naming and identity. Steve mentioned right at this get-go that we changed the name of the observatory, and on this particular side you can see that the LSST logo still remains, but the Legacy Survey of Space and Time is now the acronym, and the Rubin Observatory has a sort of an interim identity, as you can see in these slides, and so this has been a tremendous amount of focus. We ended up with a lot shorter amount of time to implement the change, and working with the NSF was extremely time consuming for the communications team to work that out. And so in the end, we do have a comprehensive style guide in both English and Spanish, and to really address things like, emphasizing Vera C. Rubin Observatory, and specifically do not use VRO as the acronym. And so lots of that is embodied in that style guide. And then we needed the new visual identity. At the unveiling at the AAS in January, there was a lot of energy put into sort of the reveal and this temporary visual identity. But now we have to work on, and the communications team led by Rand Powell is working on the logo development. And so here's just a timeline. I won't go into the details, but we can discuss at length either in the EPO breakout, because EPO is deeply involved in this, or in any of the other management breakouts as you see fit. But the objective here is that by the end of the summer, we have a new brand, a new logo for the overall observatory. And then there's just a couple of examples that visual identity for the base facility is key in the glass wall and the glass mural that's finished in the bottom left. And in the middle top, we did put up an NSF emblem on that base facility in Chile. And at the entrance to the Summit facility, we do have some visual identity to recognize the two agencies' elements. And the space above the NSF placard there on the far right is awaiting the new Rubin Observatory or the Simone Survey telescope, or both visual identities as you enter into the Summit facility. Finally, safety and this COVID-19 business. We have recognized, as I pointed out in some of the intro slides from last year, that as the project schedule compressed on the Summit and the activities were increasing in parallel, that safety was a significant concern on site. We have extended the experience that we had at the beginning of the project with multiple contractors working in many cases under large contractual management like Basalco for the Summit facility. But even when that was in play, we had EIE there. We had some of our own subcontractors also at play. So we had started early on with experience in working out how to manage these big contractors and small contractors on the Summit at the same time. That included the P-flow lift, that's our 80-ton lift in the building. And that extended even into how we built that very large building on a residential populated compound in La Serena. So all of that was extended, and all of those lessons learned, all of the capabilities that we built up in our safety team were brought to bear on the new issues with the TMA and the Dome and the Summit organization. And you'll hear lots more about it from Chuck and from the various elements, but coordination has gone well, and the safety record has been maintained. And that's primarily just due to making sure that the safety group, the technical group, the management teams all remain coordinated, that we make sure that from the top down we've set good priorities, we make sure that there's good coordination, and that we have frequent communication, and then we go back and review how things are going and collaborate with all of the teams. And that's really led to a good safety culture and a good safety record. Road safety still remains a priority amongst all of that. We did put a bus in place to really reduce the amount of traffic going up and down the Summit. So in the image on the right is our dedicated Rubin Observatory bus that goes between La Serena and the Summit every day. At 38 seats is quite full on normal days. And that's really proved to be a good way to help with the road safety. We've put lots of tight controls on the big heavy loads, both technically and safety-wise. And so there's always a safety monitor. There's always a technical monitor for each of those loads. And you'll hear from Chuck and Giovanni on just how much traffic there is, how much material has been moved, and why we continue to focus on the road safety as that priority. And then lots of different ways. Traffic accidents have kept coming. We still have them. We recognize that. And so we're constantly looking for different ways to communicate to the team, different education methods. And so as you particularly listen to the safety talks and the safety breakouts, we would love to hear other feedback. We're constantly looking for other ways. And so that breakout on Wednesday, we're gonna talk about the record. We're gonna talk about what we're dealing with. But most importantly, I want to make sure that everybody understands that we have, even though our original plan didn't have it, we have maintained the 3 coordinators on our payroll to stay on site, in addition to a vast number of contractor-specific safety coordinators. And so you'll see just how big that safety team is that we've kept in place on the Summit. And you'll hear about how we do the communication, what we do for coordination, controls, what tools we are trying to put in place to help safety, and do all of the work management. And then there's for the other element of it, which was hazard analysis that we started years and years ago from the get-go in the design phase, and just how we're verifying that, and verifying that all of those hazards that we identified have actually been mitigated in whatever way we originally set that, by designed them out or processed them out or put in measures in place and so forth. So all of those have been a significant focus as we go on. And then lastly, you can't escape the fact that COVID-19 has been the emphasis for safety since February. And so you'll hear lots about what we're doing there, how safety is absolutely completely involved in any of the work we're doing right now in our current phase 0 as the facility is shut down and we still have to make visits, and how we blend all of those COVID-19 exposure mitigations into current activities as well as planning for the future. So just to summarize on the COVID, we were ready for social unrest starting up in February again, and instead turned the planned management crisis teams into a COVID-19 crisis team. Myself, Rampal, Chuck routinely joined that call. It's transitioned a little bit as daily crisis team meeting as we started off to weekly right now. And so we've adopted how the crisis team manages the interactions, but we stayed completely involved, particularly with Noir Lab, who runs is responsible for running the Tucson office and the infrastructure in Chile. And that same thing, mentioned here, that same thing holds for Slack, and you'll hear from Vincent, and there's some presentations on exactly how the camera team is interacting with Slack on their COVID-19 and safety measures, and how they can get themselves back into the facilities that are all now, at this point, some of them are starting to reopen, but at Aura, they're still all officially closed. When they closed, we identified very specific points of contact to manage the flow, the interaction of people that still had to get in the building, and made sure that was all done safely. And the safety team gets some credit for recognizing that this pandemic was coming, and early on made sure that we had some PPE in place that has served well to get us through, particularly the beginning of the COVID era, when getting PPE was particularly hard. So we've always had enough to manage the limited amount of work that we've been doing on site and in Tucson. So as a project, we made sure that everybody had the furniture and equipment that they needed at home. Many of the team had experience working from home, has proven, particularly in the DM and EPO side, have proven to be able to adapt quite well and have functioned well and made some good progress. And I should say that across the board, it's been amazing how much progress we've been able to make. However, we should point out that there clearly are equipment operators and people that are just hands-on and need to be on site to make progress. And for those people, we worked with Aura and administration and the NSF and used their guidance to set up a safety code. And so we do currently have people that have to charge a code because they are sitting at home. We have committed to make sure that they stay fully employed, but there is time when they can't do training anymore from home, or there is no more planning they can do from home. And so there is some moderate usage of a new code for basically downtime. And so again, like everybody else in the country and the world, it's all about virtual meetings now. And even our project community workshop in August we're going to try out as a virtual meeting, which should be interesting. And there's been lots of interest in that. So that should actually be a good interaction. So there's just some more details that I'll skip here, leave for you to read. But most importantly, I just want to point out that, we have the safety element of the COVID has just really been the focus, making sure that our staff and their families, as we know, it's about how people can vector this disease, this virus into their families and beyond. That's really been our objective, and we've really maintained a close eye on government authority, mandates, guidance, etc., and have early on kept some work going. And now that it's gone on for a lot longer, are starting to increase the activity again, mostly because we have to, with winter coming on and that building being exposed, particularly with the dome as open as it is. So we have presentations in the breakout sessions to talk a little bit more in detail about how we are doing restart planning, and are happy to talk about that detail at that time. There's a slide here that just shows you our our timeline in particular, as COVID was revealing itself as a pandemic. And I'll just, one of the things I'll just point out here is that we had plans early on to be able to leave a small group of people on the summit to keep going on the dome in particular. And we were working towards that until it just became really clear that there was no way we were going to be able to do any work on the summit, and that transportation there and any safety measures were just not going to be appropriate. So in a fairly quick order, we went from let's start downsizing to it's got to be closed up completely. And so on March 20th was the last day that we had people on the summit in that original condition. Since then, lots of exposure prevention plan work gone on. Chuck is the main author of the CEPP, which is extensive in how we deal with it. The image on the top left is one of the measures that there's temperature checks for everybody that goes up that summit. And so this is our paramedic doing that temperature check on one of the staff as they traverse. That's also originally where they would get lunch for the day. In the meantime, we've changed some of those details. But the main part is that we've stayed consistent with any of the guidance that we can and really maintained as much safety measures as we can going forward. This is the restart planning that you'll see that everybody has, I think, at this point in sort of incremental stages of development. I won't go into these details, but it does show that we are currently in stage 0. All sites are officially closed. Outside of Slack, I believe, is sort of in some transition, but we are not yet in Tucson or in the site. We have plans in place for how we get what we do now in this phase 0, as well as what we will do for restart planning. And the restart planning and what we do now is just becoming more and more challenging, as you can see from this image with snow and weather systems that we're dealing with on the summit. Lots of protection tasks. I'll leave this for you to look at. But these are activities that have gone on since we shut down that we have to do to make sure that the system doesn't deteriorate and that we can handle a lot of the critical activities that were necessary. And then there's restart planning, and it's also official documentation that we're putting in place to recognize exactly how we're going to move forward from a safety standpoint. And then the technical teams are working on exactly how we get from this current state we're in, which we call sort of T0, and what has to happen to get going. And so this is just a screenshot of the various subsystems looking at where they are now and what they'll have to do. And so we can see staffing levels, resource levels, and timing for how we get everything going again. And I think everybody has also come to appreciate that stopping was a whole lot easier than getting restarted. There's a couple of slides here that just show you that we did do a risk assessment. These are not currently embedded in the financial accounting of our risks because they're separated out. But we did do an assessment. There's 2 pages of these risks to just get a sense of what we're up against now. What is the risks? And this is primarily what we use to guide what we do now, as well as to have the discussion with the agencies about. It's really better for us to do the replan as late as possible because there's still a lot of question about how we'll be able to restart. And so that's just there for you to read and to discuss later. So programmatically, at the end of February, we were 81% done on the MREFC side. We moved from $15 million of contingency to $26 million of contingency. And that really put us in a much better position from a contingency to work remaining. You remember that one of the ways that we would look at the project is to look at the various elements and the various work remaining on the things that were particularly key. And in this case, DM and EPO have been on track. They've been performing to the plan, and their risk exposure is still primarily consistent with the scope options available. That's certainly the case for EPO. DM is one of their risks is starting to increase, but only just recently as the data facility unknowns continue. And while I said at the beginning, the actual data facility issue is not ours in construction, just how we blend into it and whether our systems are compatible with that final choice is still something that we need to keep track of. And so this is just to give you a sense that the telescope and site the work there, the systems engineering, which includes the camera commissioning, DOE commissioning work, is pretty critical. And that $42 million of remaining work, that's an absolute. We have to do that through construction. The PMO, the data management, the EPO, is the other half of the work, a little bit more than half. And that gives you a perspective on where does $26 million lie of the 97.3 of work remaining in February. This is just an image to give you a sort of a slightly deeper look and see where at the level 2, the various elements of the work breakdown structure, where they are in a completion level. And it sort of falls in as you would expect. The telescope and site is very close to the same as where the camera is, at more than 90% done. And then the commissioning, the systems engineering commissioning with a lot of the end work is at the lowest percentage of completion at about 40%. Some MRSC earned value data slides that I will certainly be ready to talk to in the management for the cost and schedule, but just to give you a sense of some more of the details on where we currently expect to be with our total project cost, and that we continue to earn at about $4 to $5 million a month, and that the variances, the actual metrics have remained somewhat steady. I chose the dollar version of the metric chart, not the percentage version, because it expands it a little bit so you can see a little bit more of the features. But I think this has continued to go fairly well. And then there's the contingency allocation trends. I think we've shown this chart many times. If you're new to this chart, the key code at the bottom, the green in the background, was what we agreed with the agencies as our funding profile for contingency to match what's in the blue histogram, which was at the FDR early on in 2013, what we had predicted would be the activity-based risk and contingency usage throughout the project. And then how we've actually used contingency is the red line. And of course, the dramatic shift just recently is the drop in two bullets there from the 2 change requests that I had mentioned. Light blue is our EAC or ETC going forward. That's currently in the plan. So that just gives you a sense of why how we have changed our contingency posture in this last period. From a schedule standpoint, you'll know that we have a healthy number of level 1 milestones. I know this is a little different to the NSF side than the DOE side. These were somewhat arbitrarily chosen at the beginning of the project as level 1 milestones, even though some are fairly detailed and low level. But these were the ones chosen, and these are the ones that we track to. This particular page is all the ones that are completed of those milestones. The next page are the ones that are still open. Telescope mount completion at the end of February was still predicted to be October, but it was also still our critical path, as you see in the first line. This, of course, is a view of how we were at February, and we currently do believe the telescope mount is pretty close to the camera, still completely impacted by the dome as competing for the critical path. But this is again an image of where we were in February. Steve already showed you this schedule. This is our cartoon schedule showing that after we made the changes and at the end of February, we were back to almost 5 months of schedule contingency, with again the critical path running through, the telescope mount and the end work and sitcom impacted quite significantly by the dome. Although, as I pointed out, we were able to keep the dome from impacting the TMA to a large extent. So that's that sort of broad look at the schedule. A couple other programmatic items. Risk management has continued to go forward. Last year we were talking about a new tool, a new JIRA tool, and that tool has been functioning well. And we continue to be able to show sort of the heat map of all of the activities. I think there's 162 risks that we track. 2 of them are in the red and they're listed here. They're completely project schedule related. whether it's the internals of the MRSC and the subsystems coming together, or the repurposed multi-agency, which is basically just camera delivery as one of the other risks that we face. So that tool has also given us the ability to do Monte Carlo on our risks, which is something that we were not able to do with our original tool, or haven't been able to for several years. But we're happy that that capability is back in place. And so here's the 163 active risks and 12 opportunities. When we do, I think, a 500 iteration Monte Carlo, it turns into an 80% confidence of just about $12 million and a 90% confidence of $13 million for the post-mitigated exposure. And then the probability weighted cost exposure in the middle there currently is at 26, after mitigation is 10. So there's some numbers to give you a sense. Again, we can go into the details in the management breakout, but this gives you also a perspective on where our risk register shows we are, again, also compared to that $26 million current available contingency. Change control continues to be in full swing. We use it for everything from details to our P6 plan to anything that has to do with technical changes, any variations in or variances requested for requirements. And so this tool has been in place for the duration of the project. And as we reported last year, we have enhanced it to include an impact on operations, and not just in a technical field or a programmatic field to be entered and to be assessed, but also by adding the ops director to the change control board so that we can maintain that operations view as we make any changes in the process. We also have continued with our scope options approach in our process. There was a bit of a hiatus last year as we entered into those two big changes in January and then COVID, but I can tell you right now, we did do a refresh of the scope options. There's currently 25 that equal $12 million in scope options. The top 4 are over $1 million, and that is the vast majority of it at 8.8 million. And as you could predict, there is not much left. That if we were to implement any of these 4, it's dramatic. It would have significant changes. With most of the hardware work done, the amount of scope options is dwindling rapidly. This is just a view of how that sand chart looks for how that the current scope options at 12 million will reduce over time. And then gets me to the conclusion, which is, I realize, not necessarily justified in my talk, but I think you'll see it in the talks by the subsystems, that we were in full swing, and the progress was excellent. The projections were positive, and we were on a good path in February. We still clearly had challenges, but they were all being managed. We understood the camera, the telescope, the dome were tight on the critical path, but with restoring the schedule contingency, that put us in a much better posture. And with the operations team really getting a good foothold, we were able to really get a good sense of the transition and how we move forward there. From the COVID standpoint, the team has really responded well. We had lots of issues. The shutdown has been a nuisance in many ways, but we have had excellent engagement. The team has really responded well and demonstrated that they can be productive from home. We really owe the Summit team in particular a lot of gratitude for the amount of effort that they're putting in, having to go to the Summit and go through the extra precautions, the extra work, and being able to go up there, do the inspections, and do some of the critical maintenance. And again, also the safety team, they've been along for the ride and really taken the lead with their exposure prevention plans and doing a lot of work to make sure that we stay safe. And basically, I think we're ready to restart We're particularly looking forward to rebaseline and finish this project successfully.